much more experienced in this area. So Dr. Kolberg?
Yeah, if you can, I think you have to get rid of your screen and then I can share mine. Okay. Okay. So you should be able to see, right?
Yes.
Okay. CAPs, HAPs, and TAPs. I'm going to talk about the health effects of Covanta, Marion. And maybe someone could monitor the questions. I'd prefer to answer questions as we go, actually, if there are some in the chat. I think it just makes it easier. Here are your take-home points from my talk tonight. If you want to know what you're supposed to remember, here it is. Covanta emits hundreds of substances that are known or suspected to be toxic both to human health and to the environment. Very few studies have examined the long or short-term health consequences of waste to energy incinerators. Youth, low-income persons, people of color, and non-English speakers are at higher risk for the ill effects from these toxins, and all these populations are overrepresented in Brooks. I believe it's Brooks, not Brookings, if I'm not mistaken, but anyway. Emission standards and monitoring are inadequately protective, and no health risk assessment has ever been done for Covanta. And I'm going to come back to tell you what a health risk assessment is. Just so we're all on the same page, waste to energy incineration involves the recovery of energy from the combustion of municipal solid waste through the conversion of non-recyclable waste into usable heat, electricity, or fuel through various processes. And what Covanta Marion does is it uses heat from combustion to create steam to drive turbines that generate electricity. So what does Covanta emit? Well, first of all, the criterion air pollutants, CAPs, which are substances that have known adverse effects on human health and for which acceptable levels of exposure can be determined, and for which air quality standards have been determined by the EPA and which are regulated by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And these are mostly produced by incomplete combustion of fossil fuels and biomass, biomass being grass and food stuff and trees and that kind of thing, and by other industrial processes. So here they are: carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, ozone, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. I want to spend a little bit of time on particulate matter because it's a key pollutant. These are very small solid and liquid particles formed by incomplete combustion of fossil fuels and biomass, and they include a very broad range of toxic substances that have multiple adverse cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, neurodevelopmental, pulmonary, and actually reproductive also ill effects, as well as cancer-causing effects. Particulate matter is the principal component of fossil fuel pollution, and it is estimated to cause 20% of all deaths worldwide every year. So it's pretty significant. And it's often used as a proxy for overall air quality. The other criterion air pollutants are mostly gases, which have acute and chronic effects on the respiratory system. We're talking about carbon monoxide, which you already know probably can be fatal acutely at high concentrations. And then there's nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide and ground level ozone, which is interesting because it's not the stuff up in the atmosphere, but it's at ground level, and it's created by chemical reactions between nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds in the presence of sunlight. So this is created, in polluted urban environments on hot, sunny days, and it has very toxic effects on the respiratory system. And then the final cap, lead, which is a heavy metal, which has multiple adverse health effects, but principally developmental and neurotoxic. And then you have your hazardous or toxic air pollutants, the HAPs or the TAPs. These are toxins with known or suspected adverse effects on human health. EPA has classified 188 substances as HAPs. These are regulated by the Clean Air Act of 1970, which requires the EPA to monitor and control HAPs from stationary and mobile sources of pollution like Marion. These toxins can produce a legion of adverse acute and chronic health effects, including premature death that involve every single human physiological system. Hazardous air pollutants are substances that occur naturally and are used in various industrial processes or are emitted into the environment as byproducts, such as arsenic, some of the volatile organic compounds, and hydrogen sulfide. Also, substances that are produced through incineration or other industrial processes like dioxin and PCBs. And this is a key point. Many of these substances accumulate in the body and environment and do damage over time and are very difficult to get rid of, including the heavy metals, dioxin, and PCBs. Here's a slide. Environmental dispersion. How does this stuff get into the environment? Up here in the left-hand corner, you see the Marion stacks, and they're pouring out their poisons into the air, and this gets deposited into the water, and the ground kind of falls to the earth or is carried with the rain, where it can be consumed by various wildlife or drunk. It contaminates the groundwater and gets into the soil. It's taken up into the food web and eaten by other ground animals. It's also taken up into plants through their leaves or from the soil, or is inhaled by the wildlife. So it gets everywhere, these poisons. Whoops. There we go. Human exposure. You breathe it in from the toxins that are in the air. You drink it in from contaminated water. You eat it when you eat plants that have taken the toxins up from the soil. And then you can get it directly from the soil, either by inhaling the dust or by getting it on your skin and having it absorbed through the skin, or sometimes you even eat the dirt, like, for example, on your vegetables that might be contaminated. So let me talk a little bit about air quality standards. The important take-home point here is that meeting air quality emission standards does not mean that there are no adverse health effects. And that's very important to understand. The EPA standards tend to be less strict than those in the EU. The EPA, quote unquote, balances economics with health risk, whereas EU aims at the lowest technologically possible emissions. The standards are also one size fits all, so that they don't have different standards based on gender, race, age, size, or pre-existing health conditions like pregnancy. Those are not taken into consideration. They also don't take into consideration interactions between pollutants. For example, carcinogens can attach themselves to particulate matter and then get inhaled very deeply into the lungs, where they can exert much more easily their carcinogenic effects. Also, the combined effects of toxins are not taken into consideration. For example, the neurotoxic effects of lead and copper and mercury are worse when you're exposed to all three of those chemicals. And then the very last issue is that some pollutants have no safe levels of exposure, for example, particulates and ozone. And one last point before I leave the standards, the national standards for so-called existing waste to energy facilities are actually lower than for state-of-art facilities. And Covanta Marion, which opened in 1987, is classified as an existing facility and is therefore subject to lower standards and is a facility that in fact is in need of substantial upgrades. I want to spend a little bit of time on this 2020 Systemic Review of Health Risks of Waste to Energy Facilities. This was the first ever comprehensive literature review in the world of studies on waste to energy facilities. They looked at 269 studies and found only 19 that actually met rigorous scientific criteria. There were only two epidemiological studies that actually looked at direct short-term impacts on the health of exposed populations. There were also 5 environmental monitoring studies that actually looked at results of emission testing and monitoring. There were 7 health risk assessments, and I'll come back to what that is, which estimated the excess risk among those exposed, and then 5 life cycle analysis studies, which look at total health impacts from generation of waste to final disposal, but which importantly include the effects of greenhouse gases that all the other studies don't pay attention to. Their conclusions, I quote, appropriately designed, properly managed, state-of-the-art waste-to-energy facilities pose less risk than landfill and unsorted incineration without energy recovery. Unsorted means that all your plastics and recyclables are mixed in there. For state-of-the-art facilities, there is a lack of evidence for elevated risk in exposed populations as compared to background level of risk. So sounds pretty benign, but there were many, many methodological problems with these studies. For example, the exposures in the epidemiological studies were self-reported rather than modeled or measured. For waste management, these comparisons were made to unsorted incineration and landfill. They were not compared to zero waste strategies, which we know by far are safer. For energy generation, the comparisons were made only to coal and gas-fired plants. There were very few life cycle analyses that take into consideration the effect of greenhouse gases. But there was one life cycle analysis that compared waste to energy with recycling and composting, and that particular study found that the latter posed less risk to human health, which should not surprise anyone. Pollutant monitoring at Covanta, it's not very robust. There is a continuous monitoring system at the stack on a 24/7 basis that measures carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide. There are semi-annual measurements of dioxins and furans, and there are annual measurements of particulates, cadmium, lead, mercury, hydrogen, and hydrogen chloride. No measurements at all are ever made of nickel, chromium, arsenic, PCBs, volatile organic compounds, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and other toxins, just not anything at all. The semi-annual and annual testing is performed by proprietary firms that are hired, supervised, and paid for by Covanta with very little DEQ oversight. The total annual emissions that are calculated based on these single day measurements that are always performed with advance notice. So Covanta, if it decided to, could change what they're feeding into the incinerator that day. There is no dispersion modeling that's ever done. There have been no measurements of any toxins in the ambient air, groundwater, soil, or foodstuffs. So here's a schema that just talks a little bit, or it shows what a 4-step risk assessment process is, the kind of thing that we should be doing for Covanta. There's the hazard identification. I'm sorry, this slide is a little blurry. What health problems are caused by the identified pollutants? A dose response assessment. What are the health problems that are created at different levels of exposures? An exposure assessment. In other words, how much of the pollutant are people exposed to over a particular time period, and how many people are exposed. And you put these 3 things together and you can come up with a risk characterization, which will tell you how much extra risk of health problems an exposed population might have. This is just a schema that sort of shows you what a relative risk of 2 would be. If the folks on the left, for example, are the folks that are not exposed to Covanta, and the folks that are colored in are the ones who are suffering a particular health problem. And then the folks on the right is the population that is exposed to Covanta. And again, the folks who are colored in are suffering from a particular health problem. You see, there are twice as many of them in that population. So that means that because of their exposure, they are twice as likely to suffer this particular health problem. They have a relative risk of 2. That's what a relative risk assessment is. Now, Cleaner Air Oregon, which was new rules governing pollution that were established in 2016, identified Covanta Marion as one of the top 20 polluting facilities in Oregon, which means that it is required by these rules to do a comprehensive risk assessment. As of October 2021, the HRA had not been completed. And when I went to the DEQ website 2 days ago, it looked to me like that health risk assessment has not been submitted by Covanta, which is responsible for performing it. I want to end on environmental justice, and I'm going to read you the EPA definition because I think it's interesting. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. I like this definition because it talks about democracy. It talks about communities having the right to know what's in their environment and having the right to control their exposure. And I think that's really key to the work that is being done around Covanta Marion. The EPA designed an environmental justice index, which is a method to calculate excess environmental risk for certain geographical areas. And it combines certain measures of demographics like income, minority populations, or age, the size of the population, and the exposure, the level of exposure, into a single index. Now, these separate environmental justice indices have been calculated for 12 separate environmental risks. Anything above the 50th percentile indicates above average risk. And just to summarize what they found for the 10-kilometer circle around, centered on Brooks, where Covanta is, by these indices, this area is worse off than most other locales in Oregon for particulate matter, ozone, diesel particulate matter, traffic proximity, wastewater discharge, and proximity to high-risk facilities. And that's because Covanta is there, because it's a high-risk facility. All of the at-risk demographics except the elderly are overrepresented. So just to summarize really quickly, you have a facility that is emitting many pollutants that are known to be toxic to human health. We have really almost no idea how those are affecting the health of the population, the community that lives in that area, and that community in environmental justice terms is already at high risk for bad outcomes. So that was a lot to spew out there and not very much time. Happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or there's a section for Q&A, and Dr. Kolberg will be happy to answer them. And if you can't think of anything right now, but you think of something later on in the presentation, please still drop it in, and we can take some time to answer those questions, because it is a lot of information. Not seeing anything at the moment. I think everybody's just kind of taking it in. Thank you. That was actually really informative information that really goes into the depth of the problem that is the incinerator in Brooks. And since you were talking about social justice, I want to turn it over to David, who is going to talk a little bit about how the work, or the social justice and environmental work around this issue plays in the larger goals of Oregon PSR's work. So I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thank you, Carina. Thank you so much, Dr. Kolberg, for your presentation. I just want to follow up again just by thanking you. So I just want to shift on over to sharing my screen very quickly, and I'll keep my part short. But here is a little bit of background. So I get the role of just introducing a little bit about some of the work that we're doing, how in incineration, and how it fits within our Healthy Climate Program in Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. So just very quickly, my name is David de la Torre. I'm the Healthy Climate Program Director at OPSR. OPSR is short for Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. It's an organization that's guided by the values and expertise of healthcare and public health, and works to protect human life from the gravest threats to survival, and climate and nuclear threats, promoting peace and advancing justice. We work collaboratively with organizations in community, lending our expertise in public health issues on the local, state, and national levels, as well as the international level. And we seek a just and peaceful world for the present and future generations. So that's who we are. This is a photo of us at one of the events in the past. The Healthy Climate Action Program, or the Healthy Climate Program, is it's a multifaceted program, which includes about 7 different campaigns that we are working on. And one of them is, the stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, promoting clean air and energy, opposing waste incineration, promoting nuclear-free Northwest, and advocating for mass incarceration as a public health issue, as well as promoting healthier homes. The work that we're doing in Marion County and opposing waste incineration is part of our Clean Air program. So that falls within that sort of campaign and program. The Oregon PSR's Healthy Climate Program opposes waste incineration as part of its Clean Air campaign, where Carina is organizing. based in Marion County. Incineration, as we've mentioned in some of the presentations, is, a threat to public health, and it is expensive, and it's also the least climate-friendly waste management option. So in addition to that, also, it is a matter of environmental injustices. Nationally, 80% of incineration facilities are located disproportionately within low-income communities of color. So again, this is an issue where there's several different components to it, in addition to it being a public health issue. And we at OPSR, I think I lost the slide here. Sorry, y'all. I'm just gonna go ahead and try to load this. Okay, I think it shows now. So some of the work that we've done in the past, or just stepping back a little bit more, through this work, we see waste incineration as a serious health problem for low-income communities and communities of color who are disproportionately affected, and zero waste reduces air pollution to ensure safe and livable neighborhoods. Zero waste is something that you'll hear a little bit about in this presentation. Zero waste solutions are also preferable alternatives for a healthier Willamette Valley airshed that can also not displace impacts on other communities as we are talking about solutions. And finally, we also believe in centering the work of justice and equity in communities who are disproportionately affected by energy and environmental policies. And here you have a photo of some of the previous campaign work that we've done on incineration. But I'll talk a little bit more about that. This is a photo that OPSR members took with 350 Salem at a Metro Solid Waste Alternative Advisory Committee hearing in opposition of 200 tons of Portland's trash being sent to waste to energy incineration in Brooks, as well as some of the previous campaigns that we've been a part of. Would be opposing incineration of municipal medical waste in Marion County, opposing pyrolysis proposals in Tigard, and plasma gasification proposals in Arlington and other communities. So we're looking to promote and expand programs to prevent health effects of incineration, as well as promoting expanding programs for reducing, reusing, recycling, composting at the community sort of scale. Here is a framework that we often look at. This is the strategic framework for just transition. Here you have two sort of components of it. This was developed by another organization. It's called the Movement Generation, and it really looks and explores at some of the issues in what is defined as an extractive economy, one economy that is based on exploitive consumerism, extraction, of resources, purposes, and governance. So different components of it that are, extractive: militarism, enclosure of wealth and power, exploitation of resources, extraction of resources, and of labor. And we're shifting and looking to shift on a more, strategic level, also towards creating solutions instead of just focusing on stopping what is, the bad. So building the new, right, towards a regenerative economy, an economy that is cooperative, deep democracy, regenerative, caring of sacredness, as well as ecological and social well-being as part of its purpose. So, this is, as we look to, reimagine, looking forward of what are some, ways in which resources, our relationship to resources within this economy can look like. How can we shift that from extractive to regenerative, from burning things and dumping things to something that's regenerative, and sort of keeps in mind sort of that climate and sort of cyclical components of it. So it's very value-based, and we're really looking at kind of developing, having conversations in community in some of the work that we do for justice and social justice and environmental justice work, and a little bit more. some of the work moving ahead is also, just kind of visioning out, what door knocking, engaging people with, online workshops, such as what we're doing, now, continuing to do that work and moving in coalition and building community and collaboration, as well as engaging stakeholders in dialogue. And that's sort of part of the work that we're doing at OPSR as part of our Clean Air program. So with that, I'm just going to shift on over to reintroduce Carina to talk a little bit more about some of the work that she has been leading in Marion County. Thank you all.
Thank you, David, for that breakdown of the work. There is a question in the chat, and I know that Dr. Kolberg did talk a little bit about Clean Air Oregon, but the question is, how do we use this information to push DEQ to act to reduce the harm and risk to the people in this community? And I wanted to give Dr. Kolberg an opportunity to answer that question, just because she is so experienced in this area. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Kolberg, you're muted.
Okay, I think one of the things that we should probably be organizing around at this moment, well, a couple of things. One is that Covanta has been dragging their feet on doing this health risk assessment for years now, and DEQ keeps giving them extension after extension after extension. And this was really unacceptable for a situation of ongoing, contamination of the environment. And DEQ should be called to task about holding Covanta's feet to the fire around completing that health risk assessment. I think that's one key target for activities. And I think the other is to engage the community. And I don't know, I mean, this is kind of up your alley, Carina, I think, in terms of having the folks who are most at risk being kind of on the front line to agitate at DEQ for moving this work forward. In terms of finding out really what the true risks are. Those are a couple things that come to mind off the top of my head.
Thank you, Dr. Kolberg. And I have to agree. I mean, Clean Air Oregon is a great opportunity for that. We have not had that before. This is a brand new program. And so one of the big portions of that program is to bring those stakeholders that live in that community and to give them a seat at the table. 36 years ago when this incinerator was open, there was no seat at the table for anyone, much less, disadvantaged communities. There was no community input. It was signed without anything else beyond the bond. And so Clean Air Oregon gives us that ability, but if you don't live in that community, a great way to do it is to we've seen people who comment on articles and send it to their legislators and ask, why are the DEQ standards so low? And we have had interest from legislators specifically this year about strengthening those standards around what DEQ can do around these facilities. What kind of studies can we do to make sure that these communities who have been living here for decades are not being burdened even more with pollution and health risks. And so that's one, like reach out to your legislators about what's happening. Why is DEQ so unable to take on this work? Another one is definitely join organizations that are community driven. There's a lot of organizations, and I will talk about them a little bit more further down my slides, that are doing this work. There is, letter writing campaigns where there's legislation at the state level. There's, community organizing. We're going to need door knocking to kind of educate people about their ability to go as people who live in this community and talk about the concerns they have about their families or their workplace or their children, living in these areas. And so I think that those are the biggest ones, but Clean Air Oregon presents the biggest ability for us to be able to change something about the standards that DEQ has held around this incinerator for decades. Hopefully that kind of answers your question a little bit, Theodora. And if not, please go ahead and drop another question in the chat, and we can definitely follow up on it. Thank you, David, for that presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and go back into mine. Mine kind of leads off of the social justice aspect of it. Can you see the little screen you saw last time? No, perfect. Okay. So I go back into the community's incineration because a lot of our work, like David said, is focused on this. So we talked about how the incinerator is located in Brooks, but that's a predominantly agriculture community, right? There is damage beyond what's happening in the community, but what they're growing and they're shipping it out, right? There's damage to the environment, there's damage to the crops they're growing. It's also near wood burn, and like Patsy, Dr. Kolberg stated, there is no dispersion modeling available. So we don't know how it's affecting the woodburn community up north or even Salem down south, because we just don't have those models. And these communities are predominantly Latinx farm workers. There's also a community of Russian Orthodox believers who the language is a barrier in those communities. So they don't have access to be stakeholders in the past, and we're hoping to change that with this campaign. But these are communities that are more directly impacted by the health consequences of the incinerator because of their lack of input in the processes that have been put in place around this facility. The threats that waste incineration disproportionately poses to these communities, who are already at a higher risk of health threats caused by climate change, as we've seen in the last couple of years, is compounded by the fact that they have a year-round incinerator in their back door, which makes this a huge environmental injustice that requires immediate action. And we're hoping we can, organize and, help the stakeholders in these communities have their voices heard. Here's a picture that we actually took. That's a preschool in Brooks, and right behind it is, I'm sorry, you're
not sharing your screen. We can't see.
Oh, I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. Wow, I'm having a lot of issues today. Give me 1 second. Here it is. You see it now? Okay, yeah, so this is a preschool that sits right in the back door. Like, you can see the incinerator, the stack, that red and white stack sits right behind the preschool where children go to school. The incinerator is located right smack in the middle of Brooks. So there are preschools, there's an elementary school. Chemeketa Community College campus is right next door. There are stores and neighborhoods. I mean, on top of that, like I said before, it's surrounded by agricultural fields where people work long hours and already have to deal with, hotter summers or colder winters, on top of the pollution that we're seeing come from the incinerator. So this is the problem, right? But, there are solutions to incineration, and it is in landfilling, and it is in continuing to burn items. Obviously, the ideal process upon which we can reduce our waste stream would be to reduce use at the source, right? Make less items that have plastic and that are non-compostable. However, there's also a process for garbage that's already been discarded, things you've already used. And a big portion of this is composting. That, coupled with deep extractive recycling processes, could reduce our waste stream by a substantial amount. Anywhere from 50 to 70% of the garbage that we see going into landfills and incinerators could be reduced if we just instituted these types of waste stream reduction plans. So I'm going to go a little bit over what is composting. So composting transforms raw materials, so leaves, grass clippings, garden trimmings, food scraps, anything that's organic, into compost, which is valuable earthy soil that decomposes through aerobic decomposition. It also reduces the amount of trash pollution in your community. Not only to mention that, but it also reduces the amount you pay for garbage, right? So if you're throwing out, 30 to 40% less of your garbage, you have more room in your garbage. You can have a smaller garbage can, right? And your prices can go down, which is another burden that a lot of these communities have, that they are over charged for a lot of these services because their trash has to go into the incinerator. They don't have other alternatives available to them. So here's the fact: every year, U.S. landfills and trash incinerators receive 167 million tons of garbage. That is a lot of trash. And a lot of that could be reduced through the use of composting. And I see there is a question. Two things. There was preliminary HRA done by a consultant a few years ago. What happened to that? And also, does not Clean Air Oregon have a way for local stakeholders to talk with the facility and have some way to express their concerns and have them acted on? Changing legislation takes years, and meanwhile, children and others continue to be exposed, unjustly affecting their future lives. So the process of Cleaner Air Oregon doesn't have a process to which speak to the facility directly. It is a process done through the DEQ system of looking what are the shortcomings of the current testing, and having additional testing to figure out what new strategies need to be put in place, what new test measures need to be in place. Those haven't been decided because, like I said, that's a really brand new program. But there is not anything like that. And a lot of the reason why DEQ has a hard time with restricting the use around Covanta is because they are bound by the legal limitations that have been set forth years before. So it would have to go through that. And that is what Clean Air Oregon is trying to fast track, to have information to be able to push that type of legislation through and not have to wait, another decade to do that. Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to the presentation. So reducing our waste stream. So what are the benefits of composting? So healthy soils are essential for protecting watersheds. Composting is the best way to add in organic material to soil. When adding to soil, compost can filter out urban stormwater pollutants by an astounding 60 to 95%. Compost can aid in reforestation, wetland restoration, and habitat revitalization efforts by improving contaminated, compacted, and marginal soils. Composting can be used to remediate soils contaminated by hazardous waste in a cost-effective manner. And it enhances water retention in soils, which is a big problem that we're seeing with these hot summers and these fires. We're having issues with water retention. A lot of these areas have seen burn patches. But composting could help us in a very cost-effective way, because you're just taking garbage and you're composting and then you're using that to try to help the soil recuperate from these catastrophic fires that we've seen. It's one of the best ways to do this. Composting can also provide carbon sequestration, so it allows for it to clean the air as you use it. So the EPA estimates that in the 2018, the 2.6 million tons of food, so 4.1% of wasted food was composted. So that's not very much. And in 2008, Americans recovered over 69 million tons of municipal waste through recycling and almost 25 million tons through composting. And that's with only 4.1% of the wasted food being composted. That number would shoot up exponentially if cities and counties and jurisdictions instituted better systems of composting, which is one of our goals at Oregon PSR, to try to help and work collaboratively with the communities and the municipalities to be able to institute these new systems into their new waste plans. So one of the other things about composting is that when composting is taken up as a centralized plan by cities and counties and municipalities, composting is a great job creator. So this information, per every 10,000 pounds of waste of incineration, only one job is made. Compare that to landfilling, where it's 2 jobs, but manufacturing compost provides 4 jobs for every 10,000 tons of waste per year. So it provides 4 times the jobs that incineration does. And these are good paying jobs if we work together with the municipalities and unions to create good paying jobs in these regions, which again, these communities could very much benefit from. So it is good for the environment, it's good for health, and it's good financially. It makes good financial sense for the areas where these incinerators are. This right here is a map of places that have started across the United States, started a plan around composting. So the yellow cities are at the beginning stages of composting programs. Most of them are not centralized or led by cities. A lot of them are community led. When I mean community led, let's think about, your neighbors all get together for your neighborhood and you create a lot where you do community composting. So everybody in your neighborhood goes and puts their composting there, and they can get back, composted soil to use in their flower beds and stuff like that while reducing garbage. So that's decentralized community composting. The ones in the blue, the areas in blue, are cities or municipalities that have composting programs that are led by the city and have some sort of either law or jurisdictional power is given to either counties or cities to institute these programs. So as we can see, there's not where it should be, but a lot of places and cities are starting the process. And if you can see, there's actually 2 in Oregon that are starting the process pretty well, and that's Portland and Eugene, which I'm going to talk about a little bit right here. So we are seeing a lot of communities taking action. More and more communities across the United States are adopting composting programs and passing ordinances to reduce the amount of organic matter going to incinerators. And there's a whole list that I can put into the chat once I'm done with these slides. About where you can see what they're doing and like the results. And I got all of these from the EPA. But these are just a few of the examples that are around, and these are all cities from that map. So Alameda County, the county requires the businesses, institutions like colleges, and multifamily property owners provide containers and service for organics, so food waste and compostable paper. That also includes yard trimmings, which I didn't include here. Boulder, Colorado, in 2015, the city council adopted zero waste requirements that aim to make Boulder a zero waste city. This ordinance requires all residents to subscribe to waste hauling services, all businesses to separate recyclables and compostable items from the trash, and all property managers to provide recycling, composting, and trash services to their tenants. This is something we're not really seeing. I live in Marion County and I don't have access to a recycler at this point. It's just trash, so everything has to go into the trash, which obviously does not reduce the amount of trash we're sending into an incinerator or to a landfill. In New York in 2013, the city launched a residential pilot food scraps collection program that served over 1 million residents. It was then expanded to over 3.3 million households at the end of 2017. And I know that there's another expansion planned for the coming year. So they're seeing an incremental use of the service and also an incremental reduction in garbage in these communities that are instituting composting. So closer to home, we have seen a movement towards more access to composting and waste reduction in Portland, Oregon. In 2011, the city expanded its residential yard waste collection service to include food waste. After 1 year, the city had collected more than 8,000 tons of food waste in residences for composting. In addition to coordinating to a door-to-door campaign, the city launched Portland Compost to help residents adjust to the new service. So they did an educational campaign that was led by the city, as well as gave people the option to opt in into a composting program. So it's not mandatory, but if people know about it, they can opt in. And that's where the educational portion of it goes. Other cities have gone the route of you don't have to opt in. Instead, you have to opt out. And it's most people don't, because it's like less trash, right, that you're paying for. Eugene, Oregon, we've seen the city's Love Food Not Waste program, which began November 2011. It enables businesses to sign up for food waste collection service from private haulers at 20% below commercial garbage rates, as established by an ordinance and administrative rule. The city also offers free on-site trainings to businesses and employees. The program has grown to 200 participants and recovers over 1,000 tons of food waste annually. So this one makes it financially feasible for people to start doing waste reduction at that level, at least in businesses. It's not talking about residential, but it is on the path. And so we are seeing this, but we need to see it more outside of these two regions, right? We need to see it across Oregon in order to be able to reduce how much we not only send into the incinerator, but also how much we're sending to the landfills in Oregon, because those are not good alternatives either. So here's where we get to the portion of the night of what can you do? So we talked about supporting state and community organizations. So there's a lot of organizations that are working around health and environmental issues around landfilling and incineration. We have partners like PECUN, Beyond Toxics, Oregon PSR, and also a Clean Air Now coalition that are fighting to end incineration or to increase to decrease our waste stream. Clean Air Now is actually a coalition made up of multiple partners that live in the community of basic residents who are just really concerned about the incinerator. So there's a lot of people who are working on this item. So if you want to be involved, you can support, join mailing lists. You can also get involved at the city or county level. Many cities and counties across Oregon have climate and waste stream plans that are being revised currently. I know Woodburn has been doing a revision, the city of Salem has been doing them. And so a lot of the things that they're doing is having input from citizens about what are their concerns and what they would like to see. And if you partake in those and get involved, you could, flag that reducing waste in your community is a big one. And a lot of them have hearings, and so you could show up to those. You could write op-eds around the waste stream plans and the climate plans, because these two are tied into that, right? And then obviously make use of the programs available to you. If you live in Eugene and you own a business, make use of that program. If you live in Portland, opt into composting if you're able to, because the more demand there are for these programs, the more likely they are to be expanded. And we want that, because the more likely they are to expand it, the healthier our communities are going to be, the more financially better off they're going to be. And, also it saves the environment, so it doesn't hurt either way. So that's just kind of where we're at around composting. I didn't go into recycling because recycling is another section that we're going to do around Oregon PSR, around the different types of recycling that we're seeing currently. And we'd just be here all night if we talked about, there's so much to talk about trash. And so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And David has been putting links to the organizations that I mentioned. And if you're interested in joining our mailing list or the Clean Air Now mailing list, please put your email into the chat and we will go ahead and add you into any events, any other presentations like these, or any community events where you can help if you want to. Or just to keep updated on what's going on with Covanta or what's going on with zero waste organizing in Oregon. And then if you're interested or need any of the resources that we presented here, please email either me or David, and this is our email address, and you can keep up with us and on our social media channels here. Sorry.
There was one question about medical waste that I had a couple things I could say about. The main problem with medical waste is that it's so heavily plastics, and the incineration of plastics is the worst part of the incineration process. It's the incineration of plastics is what really produces the heaviest load of toxic materials, and that's why medical waste is a particularly tough problem. I have not read that that there are issues so much around infectious contamination related to the combustion of medical waste, and I could be wrong about that. I mean, the handling of medical waste is certainly an issue, because there can be contaminants that escaped, infectious contaminants, but the incineration itself is going to basically sterilize the medical waste, and the residue should not be infectious.
Thank you for that.
It's the plastics.
Yes, and the majority of the medical incineration that we're seeing comes from out of state.
Right.
The reason why that happens is because Oregon does not send as much medical incineration, and medical incineration is the most profitable items for Covanta to burn. And so they bring it in from out of state, tons and tons of it. There are stricter standards around medical incinerators. However, Covanta stays just under that number, so it doesn't get considered as a medical incinerator, and it can still be considered a municipal incinerator, even though it's like right at that limit where it would trigger even stricter standards. Oh, yes, and there is a Physicians for Social Responsibility in California, Los Angeles. David just put the link in the chat. If there are any other questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get back to them. Or if you're interested in just following us, I think David put the links in the chat as well. And you can always reach out to us for any of the resources. We have links to all of this information. This video will be on Oregon PSR's YouTube channel, which will be linked in our website. So if you are ever late at night worrying about garbage, you can always watch our series. There will be more about these around all types of things. We have one planned around recycling. We also have one planned around legislation around source materials. So reduction at the source, incentives for businesses to do reduction of waste. There's a lot of models around the country that are popping up. And so it's a series that we do plan to have in the future. And there will be in-person events, obviously outside in the community. So if that's something that you're interested in, please follow us. And we would love to have you there, because, you know, the incinerator being closed affects everyone. But I understand that it's in Marion County, but making better zero waste systems affects all of us, and it can be instituted all across Oregon. And I do think that Oregon can be a leader in this, a leader not only in the environmental factor, but in like leading around health issues and fixing, you know, the ability for our communities to be able to be stewards of their own communities' waste. So yeah, David, do you have anything else to say?
Thank you all for attending. And yes, as Carina mentioned, please feel free to leave your emails on the chat or reach out to us through the links that we put on the chat. And that, I think I'll pass it over to Dr. Kolberg if there's any last words too.
No, thanks everyone for coming.
And thank you, Dr. Kolberg, for taking the time and sharing with us your expertise. I'm sure this will be a material that we will be using for a long time. And thank you for everyone who attended today.